Mirza Waheed. Mirza Waheed was born and brought up in Kashmir. His debut novel, The Collaborator, was an international bestseller, a finalist for the Guardian First Book Award and the Shakti Bhatt Prize, longlisted for Desmond Elliott Prize, and was selected by Waterstone as part of its debut literary promotion, the Waterstone 11. Uh, Mirza Waheed has also been shortlisted for the DSE Prize for South Asian Literature in 2016 and longlisted for the Folio Prize and was a finalist for the 2015 Tata Literature Live Book of the Year. Mirza Waheed has written for the BBC, The Guardian, Al Jazeera English, and New York Times. Mirza Waheed's new novel, which we are here to talk about today, is called Tell Her Everything. It is a thriller and a love story with the idea of parenthood taking the central theme. It is told in the form of a confession and a monologue. A lamenting father describes his life and the reasons for his guilt. He wants to tell his 25-year-old daughter everything. Mirza Waheed, welcome to Lahore.
Thank you, thank you. I've never been to Lahore. It's my first time, and I'm very, very happy to be here. This chair is a bit wobbly, so if I sort of fall off, please forgive me in advance.
So, I want to keep this like an open discussion. So, I want to talk about your novel. I had a chance to read it, and it's pretty phenomenal. Uh, the one thing I want to talk about first is the idea of parenthood, the father-daughter relationship. The novel is told in a monologue form, a father telling his daughter about things that he's done in his life that he feels guilty about. How much of this has evolved from your own parenthood?
There's no direct relation, but this book is as old as my daughter, who turned 4 last week. I had made scribbles, lazy notes here and there before she was born. And then we all know what happens at a parent's hair. You can't do anything after the baby arrives. But in about 6, 8 months, I started to write this novel. And there's every possibility that being a father for the second time and being a father to a daughter might have crept into the novel, but I had written the premise before she was born. But there's also an indirect relation. I had to relearn how to write while looking after a little child full time, which meant I didn't have the luxury of writing, uh, in the zone that I'm going to take time off, away from children, away from the world. I had to write with the child in the house sometimes, and which took a lot of time to relearn, how to write as a father. With regard to the premise, many years ago I had spoken to a friend who works in the medical world, and he had spoken about doctors who come into contact with judicial systems, penal systems, justice systems around the world, and how they might be asked to do things that are not really a part of their substantive daily job, which then brought me to think about what if there is a man who's very successful, is a doctor, has been very, very successful, has worked hard, and has achieved everything that he wanted to achieve, which primarily means money and property and prosperity and all those things that we seek. Um, and I began to think, what if such a man has lost everything in the process? He tells himself that he has done everything he could have done in his life for his daughter. But late in his life, the book is narrated from London, where he lives in a swanky, luxurious flat overlooking the Thames. And he has everything. But he suddenly realizes that he may have paid too big a price for where he is because his daughter, his only child, is not with him. And he's waiting for the daughter, Sarah, to arrive to meet him finally so that he can come clean, so that he can tell her everything. In Urdu, he describes his life as he wants to tell Dr. Kaisar, or as he's known in the novel as Dr. K, he tells himself that he must tell his daughter his Saban hai Umri, which loosely translated becomes the accidents and occurrences of his life. The translation is by Nadeem Aslam, not by me. And so he's waiting. While he's waiting, he rehearses this conversation. He says to himself, when she comes, I will tell her this. When she comes and sits with me, I'm going to tell her this is what happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So he's rehearsing this conversation, and the form of that conversation was very exciting for me when I was writing the first draft. It became quite exciting that this is a monologue. He's having this conversation in his head. The daughter is not there, which also means he imagines the questions she's going to ask. He also rehearses what she's going to say in response to his story, which was an exciting possibility because he can't really know what she wants to ask him. But he writes the questions on his daughter's behalf and answers them, which is what the form of the book sort of acquired as I wrote them later. Uh, have I answered the question?
Yeah, so there's a series of reveals in the book because it's a thriller, and you come to the reveals actually move the plot along. My question as a writer to you is how do you come up with those reveals, and what was the process?
Because I wasn't writing a thriller. It's just been described as a thriller by someone. It may be a thriller. It's fundamentally about filial love, about a father and his daughter, and about what does. It's also about migrant. What do the migrants of the world do? They do two kinds of jobs in the world: jobs that the host community won't do or are unable to do. That's what migrants of the world do, broadly speaking. So he's found himself a success and money and all those things. As I was writing, I had to invent a structure where he is telling his daughter what he's done, but not reveal everything at the
Okay.
very beginning.
One of the most profound things that you talked about was the monologue form is such a unique form in which he thinks he's starting to narrate what the daughter is talking about. Can we read that first letter? I think that would be a good
Yes.
introduction to
Yeah,
that.
so the main form of the novel is him talking in his head to himself, but there are three letters that arrive from the daughter, which he may have read or he may not have read. This is the first letter, which is about one third into the book. The daughter lives in America, is a successful woman, as she describes herself, but she hasn't seen the father in many, many years, and he's been waiting. This is the first letter she writes, Dear Dad, I hope you're well. I have been meaning to write for a long time. In fact, I've always written to you, writing, scrapping, amending, abandoning it altogether, piecing it back together. I wanted to write it all, say it all in one go, so that I could draw from my truest feelings. I made many false starts and abrupt, possibly forced endings, until I decided to go on the train with my notebooks and pens. I feel fully together on it, in possession of my mind and heart. As the Amtrak chugs and swerves, turning the world into blurs of blue, brown, blue, and green, I find the voice I've been waiting for and write continuously, stopping only when my fingers can no longer go on. I write to my Spotify playlist. I call it Calm and Together. Have all my meals from the train kitchen and sleep very well. Please do not worry, I know you do. I travel well in great comfort, fully equipped and prepared, and face no hardship. I now do this once or twice a year. Take a long trip through this vast, strange, and beautiful country. I've been on the Crescent, the Cascade, the Zephyr, and the Starlight. But now is not the time to describe American trains. Without further ado, then, Dad. I was 7 years old when Mommy died. I remember everything about her, about you, me, about us, our time together, everything, including Mum's pasty white face, white as strained curd, when she was no more. It's mostly a blessing to remember things well, and only sometimes have I wished God would snatch my capacity to remember. I had the best childhood, Dad, and I absolutely loved it over there. After that, I didn't have a childhood. It ended at 7. I will come to that later. I have 51 hours entirely to myself. It doesn't matter whether our time then really was a happy one, whether or not I really had a fantastic time. All that matters is I remember it as the most joyful time of my life. Correct me if I've got it wrong, added anything, or made it up altogether. When this train leans or turns along a curve, I can feel my pen pressing forward, as if attempting to write outside the page. And I'm unable to keep up, to see my pen keep pace with my thoughts. I have a comfortable reclining seat. Can we shut the doors, please? Sorry. I have a comfortable reclining seat and I bring extra cushions, which I stack on the window side so I can lean on them and look at the landscape. Scenic paint shop vistas give way to ugly scrapscapes. I do this when I'm very tired, which is usually during the first few hours of the trip. I work a lot during the week. But please don't worry, I love working hard. I was saying those few years are all I have. That was my entire childhood. At 7, I suddenly grew up and was expected to grow up. You see, I was saying this and I felt it again. The little girl asked to behave all grown up. Before all that, it was perfect, really, wasn't it? It was the best place in the world, with my whole world in my hands. I was aware I was an only child, and to be honest, I was very pleased to be one. I had you and Mum all to myself. Someone or something must have looked down askance at this smug child and said, "Don't be so sure, kid." I'm not trying to suggest that the idea of a sister or brother did not cross my mind. It did. And if I remember correctly, I would have preferred a sister given the choice. But essentially, I was perfectly happy to be your only child. At the time, it didn't occur to me that I was going to be a lonely child for the rest of my life, a properly only child, an all by myself child. I had everything I wanted, and I have to thank you for that. You made sure I never had to ask twice for anything. Sometimes I would overhear Ammi say that you were spoiling me, that I had to know there were limits to what I could have. Do you remember what you said to her? What if I die tomorrow, Attia? What good is all this money if I can't spend it on my daughter? Later, at the boarding school in America, I often prayed that you would magically come to be with me every day. My dad can get anything in the world if I want to. If I wanted, I would say to my classmates. When it soon dawned on me that there were rules in the school about what I could and couldn't have, I most missed you all the more. Not for the things, I swear, but for the idea, for the possibility that if I needed anything, Dad would scour the universe for it. Over time, I've come to realize that we measure our lives in terms of the things we can't do. And I think it's a sad way to live. Perhaps a necessary but dull, sad way to live. I've thought about it often, how to exist while counting the things I can't do, I can't have, I can't be. It is a reduced way to live. When I was little, I had a mother and a father, and they loved me as dearly as any parent would love their only daughter, probably even more. Then I didn't have a mother. I was told she's gone to a better place from where she would watch over me all my life. Then then you decided to take away my father from me. I was told you had to do so in order to give me a better life, a better and fuller, shorter life, and that you would watch over me all the time. So I became an orphan with a mother gone to a better place and a father who sent money all the time, so I could have a better life. I guess a well provided for orphan is much better than an impoverished orphan. Please don't misunderstand me, Dad. You believed you did the right thing by packing me off. But has it ever crossed your mind that I might have preferred to stay with my father more so because suddenly I didn't have a mother, more so because I have never, not for a single day, not for a moment, been able to forget you and me in the morgue, waiting for Mummy's body to be cleared for next of kin. It is entirely possible that you couldn't and still can't imagine how frightening it was and how every day since then became a fright. How I keep going back to that day. I clung to you, dear Father, and I felt safer and warmer. Then suddenly, I felt very, very dry in my mouth, as if someone had fed me hot soup. So I left you aside, terrified as I stood up, my legs quivering to go and drink some water. I did so quickly so that I could come back to you and feel your body, breathing and alive. Put my arm around in your lap, touch my shoulder to your side, and smell the dad smell on you. Perhaps because I was parched with sadness and fear, I went again and again to drink water. But I didn't stand there long enough to fill my body because I was scared you might go somewhere or disappear in the meantime. What would I do then? Even when I stood at the dispenser, I tried to sense your presence on the other side of the room with my mind, my heart, my ears. For months, I didn't want to go to my room. And I panicked when I had to use the bathroom, as it removed you from my sight. Because being with you, being next to you, locking my arm in yours and feeling your pulse gave me solace and safety. The waiting room at the morgue was all white. Do you remember it? And we waited, father and daughter, daughter and father, for my mother to be released so she could be away on her final journey. Maybe what I said earlier was harsh. I'm sure you knew how scared I was. How could you not? I wanted to run out of that room, and yet I knew there was no way Mummy could come back once they brought her out. While we were waiting, and miracles are known to happen during waiting, there was still hope. I must have thought in my mind. But once that large inner door opened, there was only one way to go, only one destination for her and for you and me, the graveyard. Yes, Dad. I knew. How could I not? Perhaps that's why I swallowed all the time, felt a scratchy, prickly dryness in my mouth. The idea, the fact that they would bury her soon, put her in a grave, in an ummi sized hole in the dry earth, and cover her with a mound of earth. I recall feeling bad for her, that they would spoil her pristine clothes, fling dirt on them, make stains. I didn't know what a shroud was. Or maybe I knew, but didn't think we'd make Ummi wear one. By the way, do you remember her triangle shaped prayer time scarf? Green color? I kept it with me because it smelled of her body spray, and something else too, jasmine and citrus and wildflowers, always natural ingredients for my cool mum. The scarf gave away that scent for years, but only faint occasional whiffs now. I still have it, of course. You and I in the hospital van at the front because you didn't want me in the back with her. I heard you whisper to Uncle Biju, so caring. I haven't been able to figure out whether I might have been better off being close to Mum, clasping her hand as you led her to the grave. I'm being totally honest, I don't know. What is better? Glimpses of dead mothers or a proper walk together to the grave? Which is more forgettable? Which requires less therapy? Here's what I have always wanted to say to you. I never thought I'd leave your side after Mom left us. I believed it was entirely up to me to stay with you as long as I wanted. I was terrified of being alone, scared of being away from you for even a moment. But the idea that I'd be sent away, flung across oceans, never crossed my mind. It was inconceivable then. It is incomprehensible now. I became an orphan the day you handed me over like a little pet to Uncle Akil. I think I lost you the day I boarded that flight. Please don't misunderstand. There's far too much you and I have misunderstood or misread over the years, but not anymore. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. That was pretty good. Um, what I wanted to talk to you next about is there's a very profound immigrant story in that is in the center of this whole thing. And the immigrant burden is something that we both of us are very aware of. The immigrant will do things the native cannot, uh, and that's probably the first thing that I picked up on. How does that play on the main character's mind as you know the burden that he's carrying, which results in the guilt that he carries, which becomes the narrative of the book?
Yeah, so Dr. Kaiser, Dr. K, he arrives in England at the young age of 28 from small town India, from Saharanpur. He's a small town man gone abroad. And as with most middle class, lower middle class families, you're taught to study hard, work hard so that you can have a successful career. And what do South Asian parents do when they tell their children what they have to do? That you have to become a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or a professional. So that's what he does. He works very, very hard. He studies very, very hard. He's a good student and he's a good doctor. But when he arrives in England as a young man in the 80s, he arrives in the 80s, he can't really find himself fitting in. He doesn't see himself as very successful. He's a bit impatient because the system in England is different. It takes him time. He does locum, he does temp work, which gives him a sense of incompetence. Although he's a competent doctor, but he begins to doubt his competence. He begins to doubt his proficiency as a medical, surgeon, which then impels him to look for better paying work. He spends about 2 years in London. Um, and the burden, the immigrant burden, plays on his mind in the sense that because he has to prove himself, he thinks he has to do a lot more compared to other people in order to be successful. And that's where he makes this small mistake. He leaves. He goes to another country uh, where he is paid more and he's more successful.
Wonderful. Um,
So he's a double migrant.
yeah. And did you have to do a lot of research in the field of medicine to come up with this character? Because I think it's not very easy to, you know, just create a doctor. You have to have had some kind of research done. Sorry, my question is, have you done any research in the field of medicine to come up with this doctor character?
Uh, as I said, I stay home and I don't work anywhere. I work for myself. I write, and I did what lazy writers do. I did internet research, which I was not very sure of. But when the book was finished, my publisher sent it to a surgeon in India, a very bright surgeon, and I was very surprised that he didn't find many holes in the medical world. Uh, it could possibly do with I have friends who are in the field and I've spoken to them over the years. But also his field is not very specialized. He works in the A&E. He's an A&E doctor. He patches up broken limbs and arms and things like that. And he performs the surgeries. I had to look up a little bit on anesthetics and things like that.
So, Dr. K, throughout the book, has this. He knows he's done something wrong, but as a reader, I felt he thought that it was the environment that created that for him to do ill deeds. He wasn't really owning up to what he did, but also just blaming the system that was surrounding him, the atmosphere that was around him. Why is that?
You see, when he's a young man, he doesn't see himself doing anything wrong. He's someone who plays by the book. He follows rules. He likes the system. He works within the system. And um, he doesn't think he's doing anything wrong. It's only later, when he's about 60, when he's all by himself, when he's lost the things he most cherishes, he most values, he begins to think that he may have lost his soul in the process. It's retrospective morality.
He has a lot of existential angst.
Yeah, he's a morally exhausted man, because now that he looks back over his life and he realizes that he may have crossed the line, he may have crossed an ethical line when he was 30, when he was 35, in pursuit of power and money and happiness. He may have crossed over to the dark side, so to speak. But back then, when he's a young man working as a successful doctor, he doesn't think he's doing anything wrong. He just follows what he's asked to do. He does what the state has designed. There is a penal system in place in that country, of which he becomes a small part. And the doctors are required in that penal system to carry out certain procedures. And he happens to be one of those doctors. But when he's doing it, he doesn't think it is necessarily a wrong thing. It's only later. And he also tells him constantly that his daily job is a normal one, which is of an A&E doctor. It's only sometimes that he helps out. In the novel, it's called the corrections, the Department of Corrections. So in the Department of Corrections, they require doctors to help. And Dr. K finds himself in a place and time where he is the doctor asked to help at corrections.
Can you talk a little bit more about the corrections without giving too much away, or is,
I will try. I want people to buy the book. So I don't think I want to reveal everything. He is part of
he's a fixer-upper basically?
yes, he works in a very big hospital, a very uh, and that hospital is in a town which is run by a man who also runs the hospital. He's the administrator. The administrator obviously administers justice as well. And he finds this agreeable young Indian doctor who will do everything that he's asked to do. So from time to time, he takes patients from corrections who are brought to the hospital to be, yeah, for the dispensation of justice.
Um, I've, from my point of view, what is your writing process like? The creation process of I'm intrigued to know. Do you do a lot of freestyle writing and then hone in on? Do you do a lot of
Can you?
freestyle writing? Oh,
It's
sorry.
you. It's you.
Do you do a lot of freestyle writing and then you know kind of make it tighter at the end, or how does the creative process for you?
I will be very honest. I wrote this novel essentially when my daughter allowed it. So you pack your kids off to school and nursery, then you come home, then you realize you have 5 hours within which to do your chores and your writing and all those things. So I wrote this in that rewired method, which was you get these little snatches of time and you write carefully. I wrote it slowly and carefully, but in batches. In terms of my larger method, there is no method, so to speak. There is no particular method. But broadly speaking, I work with voice and character a lot. So I didn't start writing this until I was sure I have this man's voice in my head. I wanted to speak like him. I wanted to think like him, which means I had to try and put myself in the shoes of a young doctor from North India who is from an Urdu-speaking family. His father laid great emphasis on reading and writing. And his father in the novel says there are only two kinds of people in the world: those who read and those who don't read. And I broadly agree.
This brings me to my next question. So the narrator has a very unique voice. How did you know that this was the right thing? When did it click for you?
You
Right.
are right. You are a novelist, so you know there is a moment when it clicks, isn't it? I tried third person narrative, which meant I had to be the all-knowing, omniscient author, so to speak, and write from the point of view of this man. Then it didn't work. It didn't. I was. It was too. There was too much of me in the voice. But I wanted it strictly from the point of view of this man, and he's a peculiar man. He's a specific character. He grows up in small town, lower middle class family in Uttar Pradesh, a family of limited means. Has worked very hard. Has taught himself over the years. Even after being a successful doctor, he reads a lot. He's an autodidact. He thinks of himself as an excavator. He works with words. Uh, so I kept those markers in front of me, and and one day the voice seems to sort of click.
And you just know that it's right.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
That's perfect. Uh,
Right?
uh, I think we have enough time to take questions from the audience. What's up?
But I want to say one thing. I really liked writing the daughter's letters.
Yeah, those are very
Not
very
that I didn't
moving.
like writing the other parts, but when the daughter, I was sitting in, we have a small balcony in our house in London where we live, and I wrote the letters in longhand on a notebook with my pen at night. Uh, because I wanted to, because it has to be a different voice as opposed to the father. She's more erudite, she's cleverer, she's more cerebral. Um, and she's one of those people who scoff at the idea. She says things like, we are known as successful career women, uh, which is never applied to men. You
Yeah,
know.
and it's unique in that it's not really her writing it. So
So I wrote in longhand because I wanted her voice to be very different. So I wrote the entire letter in a notebook. I filled a notebook with her letter, which then I worked on and made into three letters.
Okay. I'm Mustafa Bilal, and I've like two questions. We have 30 minutes, I hope. That's enough for two. Uh, when you were reading those passages, one thing I noticed was the sensuous quality to it. Uh,
Sorry, can you speak up, please?
when you were reading those passages, I noticed the sensuous quality of that writing, the way she describes smell and, these sensory organs and stuff like that. What I wanted to ask you was, could you shed light on the body of the father, which I suppose plays very important role there? We talk about the emotional and psychological aspect of it, but we do not discuss the body as a physical feature. Um, can you shed some light on that?
She's missed her dad. It's a very primeval feeling in children that when you are without parents, what do you miss as a little person? You miss the sensory presence of a parent. You miss that body. You miss that arm. And you also miss that smell. And she describes it directly. She says, the dad smell. And that was my way of capturing what a child who's away from her parent, has been away for a long, long time, might miss. But also, how does she describe the father? The only way available to that kind of child is sensory, that she remembers everything. She says she in some at one point in another letter she describes him baking mini cupcakes for her, and she remembers the colors of the cupcakes. She remembers the icing on the cake. She remembers the little decorations on the cake. So that's how she has remembered. But she's also all she has is memory, and she's at one point she says she trains herself to hoard memories, so she has memorized everything. She has forced herself to become this mnemonic person where she's kind of remembering everything. She has kept her mother's scarf all her life, and over the years the scent on the scarf has disappeared, but she has it. She's kept it with her. So I think, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does answer your question. I think it's a subversion of that mother thing. When we talk about mother body, we usually talk about that. We don't usually talk about the father. And so it does answer the question. Another one was, do you think the expectations from the adopted country has any relation to the expectations as a father?
See, there's a question that's often asked of South Asian writers in England, in America, which is that South Asian writers will do a certain kind of novel. They will write a certain kind of book, which is to do with themes that pertain to migration and diaspora and all those things. So while the story does pertain to that world, but I didn't want to do any of that. So I wanted to talk about a man and his daughter. And I was also, because you're a novelist, so I was also interested in the form of the novel. You know, how do I, because my first two novels, my first novel was a first person narration of a young boy who's about 17 to 19. The second was third person narrative, where I did all where the gap between the authorial voice and the narrative voice is very thin. Here the gap is clear, because it's not me at all. This is someone else describes it. To come back to your question, I have become slightly tired of the expectations of a writer such as me, so I don't really care anymore. I'll write what I want to write.
Just further on that, like the coming back to the immigrant story, why does Dr. K feel that he cannot assimilate? Was or he's being forced to assimilate, but he's not good enough?
Because he's an aware, he's quite self-aware, He's quite self-aware. He doesn't want to check all the boxes of the assimilated immigrant. He says at one point that you expect me to wear bling headgear and colorful shoes and, go to a party thrown by white people, but I must be dressed in ethnic clothes and things like that. He scoffs at the idea. So he's quite aware of all those things.
And he
And
ends up in parties where he's just looking at books.
and he goes to
Yeah.
these parties where he's invited to assimilate and mix in, but he ends up looking at the spines of various books in these parties and looks at the titles of these books and tries to make small talk, but only for about 2-3 minutes, and then he can't do it. He's a bit like me.
As to how come you did this to me or something like that.
It's in the third letter.
Oh, it's in the third letter. Okay.
She's not, she loves him dearly, absolutely. But she's also very exacting. So at one point, I can give away that bit. She says to her father, "You are a good man. You were a good man. You are a good father. You were a good father, but not good enough."
Just, I'm Karina saying, my question looks at this particular letter and seeing it in the context of the whole novel. I feel you seem to be talking about not just separation in terms of a divine intervention, but in terms of existence that has emerged today because of various needs that one gets into. So it resonates in that context with the reader at many levels. Like when you talk about one, she has accepted because it's a divine intervention, but one is economic. And we have so many sort of, narratives going on if you're a reader into your head that links at so many levels, and as a result, it leads to a certain grief, if I may so.
Yeah.
It leads to a certain grief which you have really captured very
I agree. I completely agree. There is a certain melancholy that exists in all migrants and immigrants of the world, I think. And that melancholy comes from not just uh, nostalgic memories of home, but also there is a hole somewhere.
and it's a reality.
It's a reality of our world. And that hole, you keep plugging it with various things, Also, not just material things. You build a life of your own. You have relationship. You love, and you have children, and you have. But there is a hole of the home country that stays somewhere. And that breeds that gives rise to a certain melancholy, which I think affects all people who leave, including myself. But but I have a lovely daughter, so yeah.
Uh, First of all, it's very nice that we get to have a foreign author here.
I can't hear you, sir. Sorry.
Is that you asking me that question, or is the author asking me that question? You can't hear me still? You can't hear me.
I can hear you now.
You can hear me now. Alright, so it's pretty decent of you to first of all take time out of your foreign affairs, whatever time that you spend in perhaps youthful things, like as useful as this is. Uh, my context would not exactly be specific about what you talked about in the book. However, to a degree, it might be. When I read fiction, there are certain rules to the whole book, and after a while, you get meddled into the characters so as such that if there's a girl, if there's a mother, if there's a father, you tend to become all of those characters. And then there is this factor of audiobooks these days, which portrays a voice on through which all those characters are being played. So what happens is that you kind of lose your identity. The most like the better the book is, and the most fascinating character out of which the book is, you are that person. And my fear is that sometimes we become that person for such a long time that we forget our identity, and or either it becomes a part of our identity. So is that an offense? Is that the trick of fiction? Is that a sin? And are books to be treated like something which is to be afraid of, or something to be cautioned away from? And perhaps this is not exactly accountable to your presentation today, but I feel strongly about this regarding almost every fiction that I've been through so far. So if you could shed some light on that, I'll be grateful. And if you feel that this is irrelevant, once again, I won't take offense. And that's pretty much it.
No, no, you should not take offense at all, neither do I. And there are two possible answers to the question. I'll be very brief. The only method writer who inhabits the mind of a character I know of is Nadeem Aslam, who's a friend. And when he wrote his novel called The Blind Man's Garden, he blindfolded himself. For a few weeks in his house in order to feel what it is to live like a blind man. And he had bruises and bumps because he would be hitting walls and doorways and things like that. I'm happy to announce I'm not that kind of writer. I do not become this character. Yes, but at the same time, it was hard to write. There were a few months of torment when I was writing this man's voice because you have to try and step into this person's head. which was a bit difficult, but I emerged healthy and with no damage whatsoever done. No, no, really, but you're right. It does, because at one point, when you are inhabiting this character, and it's a very, very strange, scary place to be in.
Calculation. That person got so much intertwined with the book that he actually held a gun and he shot him. And there are certain characters, for instance, Polanski, and the murders at his place. Now we're not talking about books anymore. We're talking about a movie structure, which is sometimes even more direct and more forward and more enabling. So a group of people got in, murdered his wife, and destroyed his home, and basically destroyed his whole life based on fiction.
Terrible.
It's
But
not. It's not.
let's go back to the book. And yeah.
It's not exactly terrible. It's kind of important. First of all, a blind man
Do you have a
talking.
question, sir?
I'm through.
No, no. Do you have a question?
Sorry, Assalamu alaikum.
So we have,
I have a question.
we have one, sorry, go ahead.
I have a question.
Right.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm very glad to find you here because I'm from Srinagar. We share our hometown. So, can you hear me, sir?
Can you speak up a little?
Yeah, sure. I said I'm from Srinagar. I'm very glad to find you here.
Nice to meet you.
Same here. So in your books, you talk about the feeling, memory, and the human experience. Now, since you belong to that conflict-torn region, I can't help but think that you've been through all those experiences, or maybe heard about them, or whatever. So, how important do you think it is for a writer to distance himself from that feeling, to be able to document it, or to be able to write about it?
Distance is important. When I was writing my first novel, retrospectively speaking, I was pleased was away from Kashmir, for instance, because it brought a certain degree of detachment that you need to write with integrity. When I say integrity, by which I mean you have to be true to the story. The grammar, the architecture, the arithmetic of a story has its own sort of logic, and so you have to be honest to those things, and distance helps in that. I was pleased, and for the second novel, it didn't really matter because there was a bit of, I wouldn't say autobiographical, but there was a lot of stuff from my early childhood in my second novel. It was my grandfather was there in some form. Uh, my uncles were there in some form, and the place in Srinagar I grew up in, near the Dal Lake, and downtown Srinagar, if you're familiar, is a magical place. So I spent a lot of time, a lot of childhood in downtown, in the old city in Srinagar. So a lot of it went into the novel, and I didn't mind it. It was perfectly fine. It worked very well.
So,
My name is Jalil Akhtar. I've got a very simple question to ask. It is easy to categorize a piece of fiction as written in confessional mode, if I can say, but presuming it's written in the form of monologues, in the form of correspondence, especially genre. I really wonder, since there is a tradition of confessional literature, for example, Russian literature is exercising the mode of confessional writing. Did you have a literary model in front of you when you were writing or experimenting in this form of narration?
It's a very good question, actually. I read a book a few years ago called Pereira Maintains. It's a fantastic novel. I recommend it. Everyone should read it. It's a very slim novel by Tabucchi, the Italian writer who lived in Portugal. And it's his most famous work, Pereira Maintains. And Pereira Maintains is exactly this. Pereira says this, Pereira says that, Pereira says that. It's a great text as well, in terms of exactly what you mentioned. So it is confessional. But within the confessional structure, Tabucchi creates this brilliant, strong, vivid voice of this man who I think the magic of the book lies in, though it's a first person narrative, you see him so very clearly as if it was written in third person. You see him, how he dresses, you see how he feels, you see how he smells, you see how he eats. And I think that was masterful. I don't know if there was a direct influence from Pereira Mented, but that's the only sort of model that comes to my mind. I read it a few years ago. And it's a great text. I recommend it. Everyone should read Pereira Mented.
Hello.
Hi, Anna.
So I'm in the middle of this book, and I've read all your other work. And what I take away as a reader is that the way you create your characters is very interesting. What it does for me is it makes me question morality and the binary between good and bad, and makes me realize that it's far more blurry. So Collaborator had that as well, and what I've read of this book, it has that too. And I think it helps humanize, right? So when you tell the story from these characters, it creates empathy and we can perhaps humanize. I'm just wondering if, because for me it's a recurrent, from Collaborator and I also see it in this, is that something you think about, that you've given thought?
Yes, it's an important question. I am, as a writer, I am interested in ambiguity, and I like to write about marginal characters, people who exist on the margins of social structures, political structures. They interest me as a writer. But because I'm not a very, very experienced writer, I've only written 3 books and a few essays here and there, so I tend to think of, yeah, you learn as you go along as well. Someone once said to me that, the moment a writer removes self-doubt from their work, that is suicide as a writer. So I have stuck to that notion, that you need to question yourself as well, which also then brings me into the kind of subjects I will deal with. You're absolutely right. Ambiguity is, and it's quite rich to delve into, to dive into.
Your work is just beautiful to read. Every sentence is a gem.
Thank you very much.
I haven't read this one, but was not writing about Kashmir, did you make a special effort to do that this
I
time?
was waiting for that question. And I'm ready. No, it was, I didn't make a conscious choice, but as a writer, in the industry they say the horrible phrase is you have to grow as a writer. I don't know how much, how tall you have to grow. But the premise, you see how I work so far, is the premise arresting enough? There are stories and ideas that get into your head. Some take hold, some don't. This one took hold. And as I said, when Zarrar rightly talked about the form of the novel, it interested me a lot, the form of the novel, because I also wanted to not experiment, but to see what happens, to ask myself questions. Is this possible? Can you write a novel like this? This is basically a novel. It is set in a flat by the Thames, but it's also set in a hospital. He doesn't leave the flat. He orders groceries online, and they get delivered in nice packaging. He has underfloor heating. He looks at the Thames. He has a glass of wine sometimes 2, sometimes more, and he thinks and rethinks and ruminates and reflects. He's a quasi-philosophical creature. So that interested me a lot. So which meant I must do it, and yeah, it was. There were parts which were difficult to write, but yeah. Thank you.
Well, I should not be asking this question because it's very odd to ask an author to interpret his own writer, but I will dare to ask it. Well, one of the qualities of great literature is that it embodies the basic human archetypes. Uh, so my question is this: does your writer, in any form, represent the psychological archetype, and more precisely the Freudian archetype, the relationship between a daughter and a father?
But this is a question usually for a psychologist or a philosopher, but I will try. I, you see, in fiction, if you do a lot of what is called psychobabble, uh, it doesn't really interest me, because then you're preaching to the reader. Sometimes I think sometimes we don't credit readers with enough intelligence. I think readers are always smarter than you think they are, is what I have so far understood in my short career. The readers are way smarter than you think. Which brings me to the question that if you psychoanalyze a character and you present a psychological profile of a character and everything, then you're chewing it for the reader. You're asking them not to do any work, which I think it doesn't interest me. I think readers are way, way smarter than that. And you, as a writer, you should ask them to work a little more of, making their own, judgments about a character, whether their psychological well-being or anything else.
I think we have about 10 minutes left, so we can take two.
Yeah, hello, thank you so much. It was interesting to listen to you. I have just this very general question. When you write, and it's something about like I'm just an aspiring. I aspire to be a writer too. Like this is something I'm working on. I write for the newspapers. When you write, so where does your creativity come from? Is it out of wonder, or is it out of the experiences that you have in your life, some unpuzzled stories that you want to reflect through it, or is it just coming out in the form of just to chase the pleasure?
You want to answer that?
So,
I'll add.
okay, so so fiction writing is very different from essay writing in that the subconscious does a lot of the work for you, right? So when you are doing a lot of the writing, the subconscious will develop things that you yourself are not aware of. You then just become a vehicle for that narrative. That's what I found. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. See, a lot of the fiction is not providing answers. You put the question there, or questions there. Because I don't think it's a novelist's job to provide definitive answers, and there are no definitive answers. You put the question there, you put the problem there, and then you examine the problem, and you put it out there. In terms of where does it come from, sometimes you use a very good word. The sense of wonder is important, about our completely beautiful and crazy, insane world. In the case of this novel, I was interested in what I call moral exhaustion. What does it mean? What is, what does a morally exhausted being look like? Is what I wanted to ask myself primarily, and that's how you then sort of you keep doing it. And I wrote about 3 drafts of the novel, 3-4 years, and but you're never sure until even when it's done, even when it's out there, you're never sure. I yes, of course. I like memory as a good. It's a good device. It's a good tool to go into. And I grew up in a very interesting, beautiful, brutalized place. A lot of that does infect your work in good ways, mostly. And there's no point keeping that away or blocking that off. It's because it's life.
Do we have another question in the audience? Sure.
So, if you could elaborate this nature of confession, the source of confession, other than having to admit the love which you cherish for your kin, I think that one of the themes of this novel revolves around kinship as other than being merely a narrative that is written in confessional mode. One of my questions is the source of this confession, does it come from within or is there some external imperative? Like referring to one of the theorists, I really wonder if I should refer to Foucault here. He says that the source of confession, comes from a figure of authority like a priest. But then I think from receiving the impression from your conversation, the source of confession can be the source of your own being,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So,
In
some
the case of
internal.
this character, the confessional impulse comes from his need to come clean to his daughter. 1, 2, he actually worries on a very basic or rudimentary level. He worries that he doesn't want to die without telling his daughter his life story. He wants to sketch a life portrait of himself, and he tries to portray a rather empathetic, sketch of himself for his daughter. That's where the need for him comes. He wants to tell Sarah, his daughter, this is the kind of man I have been, and I haven't been so bad. Please agree with me, is what his question. He's unbelievable, but when you read the novel, there's also layers of justification and rejustification and self-deception and all those things. I've tried, but let's see if it works. Yes. He is in some torment a lot, and which has not been helped by the fact that he lost his wife early on, who he dearly loved. He was a devoted, loving, doting spouse. So he's an ordinary man. He's not He's not evil, so to speak. He's an ordinary man. Yes, yeah. But at the time, he thinks he's doing the right thing. All his life, for most of his life, he's believed and told himself and convinced himself that he's done the right thing by sending her off. It's only later, when he's about 60, he's now waiting for her to arrive, and we don't know whether she will or she won't.
Is there any other questions from the audience? Go ahead, sir.
I will do whatever I'm asked to do.
There is this one interesting question that I came across in my mind. When you write, writing is something like you create. It's God's way of communication, right? So when you write, do you at a point in time when you're writing, when you're dealing with a particular character, and you're trying to bring twists in his or her life, and do you feel guilty for that? How to actually mold that story and as a creator, like I mean,
Do I feel guilty?
yes.
No, I don't. I don't feel guilty. I just feel tired all the time.
So if there's no further questions, ladies and gentlemen, Mirza Waheed.
Thank you very much.
Everything.
Thank you. And thank you, Lahore, for having me.